This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Anheuser-Busch. Here is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. The Space Shuttle Columbia, after a perfect launch early this morning, continues to perform well as it orbits the Earth. Astronauts Young and Crippen have gone to bed now. The White House reported that President Reagan watched TV coverage of the mission on this, his first full day out of the hospital. Joe Louis, the legendary brown bomber of boxing, died today in Las Vegas. He was 66. And this scene today in Poland was as foreign to that country as all the recent labor strikes. It was a peace march and rally. The NBC camera crew that covered the story was threatened with expulsion from the country by Polish authorities. I'm Jane Pauley in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Polaroid. Here is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. Astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen, shown here earlier today in a telecast from space, are sleeping now. Their Space Shuttle Columbia is performing, in Young's words, just like a champ. In Moscow, the Soviet news agency said that the Columbia will test a laser weapon guidance system. The brown bomber, boxer Joe Louis, died today at age 66. He held the heavyweight title for 12 years. For the second day in South London, violent clashes between the police and blacks. The new fighting began after more than 1,000 police had cordoned off the area following rioting on Saturday. I'm Jane Pauley in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
NBC News Update, sponsored by Volkswagen Jetta. Here is Carol Simpson.
Good evening. Pope John Paul II's physical condition continues to improve. Doctors say that although there is still some danger of infection, they are optimistic. Italian authorities believe the man accused of shooting the Pope was not some fanatic acting alone, but more likely the agent of some international terrorist organization. President Reagan welcomed South African Foreign Minister Botha to the White House today, thus ending a 3-year freeze on U.S. relations with that apartheid nation. And Roy Williams, who is under investigation by the Justice Department, was chosen today by top Teamster Union officials to replace the late President Frank Fitzsimmons. I'm Carol Simpson in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
NBC News Update, sponsored by National Car Rental. Here is John Palmer.
Good evening. In an interview with NBC News, Egyptian President Sadat says the United States has been buying Soviet-made weapons from Egypt to pass on to guerrillas battling Soviet occupation in Afghanistan. Pentagon sources confirm that the United States has been supplying the Afghan rebels with Soviet-made arms. President Reagan, under heavy protection, returned to the Washington Hilton Hotel for the first time tonight since he was shot there last March. The president entered the building through an underground garage. Tonight in Albany, New York, the controversial South African Springboks played an American rugby team while demonstrators chanted against South Africa's racial policies. I'm John Palmer in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update. Here is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. Despite some violence, Guatemalans in a heavy turnout voted today for a new president. There were 4 candidates, all conservatives. Leftists boycotted the election, calling it a fraud. President Reagan meets Senate Republicans Tuesday to try to stem a budget revolt. The head of the Senate Budget Committee, Pete Domenici, says the deficit has created a frightening economic situation. The United Rubber Workers Union tomorrow begins contract talks with tire makers. Despite plant closings, layoffs, union officials oppose concessions. Work is on schedule for the 3rd launching of the Space Shuttle Columbia later this month. Today, fuel loading was finished. I'm Jane Pauley in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Capsule. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. Special Prosecutor Leon Silverman today, for the second time, cleared Labor Secretary Raymond Donovan. Said Silverman there's insufficient credible evidence linking the Labor Secretary to organized crime. The government reported retail sales dropped almost a full percentage point last month, and the Urban Institute tonight says President Reagan's economic program hasn't worked out the way he hoped it would. Finally, the calendar says it's summer, but there was snow in the west, up to 8 inches in Montana, and the Jerry Ford Golf Tournament in Colorado Started out with snow on the ground and reports of golf balls the size of hail. I'm Linda Ellerby in New York. More news later on NBC News Overnight.
This is NBC News Update. Here is Mike Moss.
Good evening. A federal jury in Washington tonight found John Hinckley not guilty by reason of insanity in his 1981 shooting of President Reagan. The people of Britain got some welcome news this evening.
Her Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, has given birth to a baby son. God save the Queen!
The Florida Senate has rejected the Equal Rights Amendment for a fifth time, killing its chances for ratification by the June 30th deadline. And Dorothy Thomas, who is the mother of 4 and lives near Philadelphia, won $5.5 million today in the Pennsylvania lottery. I'm Mike Moss in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Capsule. Here is Edwin Newman.
Good evening. There was more testimony today on the Palestinian refugee camp massacre. The Israeli military commander in Beirut indicated that Lebanese Christian militiamen were permitted to continue their sweep through the camps long after suspicions of the slaughter arose. Just 3 days before scheduled pro-solidarity demonstrations in Poland, Catholic Archbishop Glemp denied that he was soft on the military regime, but said the church opposes violent protests. In Canada, Ford Motor Car Company workers agreed to give financial support to striking Chrysler workers. That strike could trigger American layoffs beginning tomorrow. I'm Edwin Newman, NBC News, New York.